Hello everyone, today we talk about the late Republic and Roman Legionary, and today we make a conceptual history. We have been talking a lot about the Roman army and Schwerpunkt, and we'll keep doing it. We have talked about the legionary equipment, transformations of the Roman military, and this, as you know, this is a topic that I'm particularly interested in, albeit I'm a medievalist, but I spent, a considerable amount of my youth to read and think about this stuff, and I actually find it very, very fascinating. I think a conceptual history is important because I think every person is able to make a list of things like, talking, as we will do today, for example, about the Marian reform, or about the legionary equipment, and making a list and saying, okay, that's how it was, taking a bunch of dates and getting a few data in a row. But actually, and what I see that is very poorly done around, and actually I wouldn't even know who to address you in these terms. If anything, on YouTube, of course, it's plenty of books that I can't even make a list and you can read. Obviously, we know such thing historiographically speaking, but that's the reason also a bit why I am on Schwerpunkt, right? To make people aware, not to teach people, because I don't like cathedratic attitudes and stuff like that, but to make the greater audience aware, the greater public, let's say, aware that there is more, right? More than you can find, for example, on YouTube. Well, naturally, I have some kind of ambition to do some, different, at least, content than the usual, than the average, but definitely these are not things you can learn on YouTube. Just be aware that there is much more, and that really what matters, historically speaking, are not dates and names. You have to know them for sure as a beginner, but what really makes the difference at the end of the day is the concept behind it. So the history of the Roman military suffers a bit of these attitudes, because the Roman military is arguably, one of the most famous, if not the most famous, military in history. In the West, we obviously have this great and legitimate fascination and interest towards it, and the Roman army has become a kind of an icon in many ways. But understanding the right mechanisms is something a bit deeper, that requires a bit more of understanding, a bit more of open-mindedness and flexibility, and also honesty, right? Because certain things are told not just because there is a genuine misunderstanding of certain topics, but also because someone wants to push certain visions that are really intentionally ideological sometimes. Maybe today we'll stay out of it because I really don't care about it. At the end of the day, I think the Roman military, fortunately, is such a big topic that has generated enough debate to make people understand that there is more, that there is a kind of an objectivity of interest, but it's of fact-checking availability, let's say. But conceptual histories are particularly important to look at the broader picture, right? Not just to get the detail, but to get the whole picture right first, which is what I think education should be able to do, because you should both learn things by heart and understanding these broader conceptions at a time, because they develop both memory and critical skills that are what you need essentially at any time, right? So it can't be just one or the other. They have to go together. So talking about the late Roman Republic, here I haven't set limits. I think we'll talk essentially from the Marian reform onwards, but also in here we have really to understand a lot of things of what the Marian reform, for example, was, and the fact that it didn't quite start anything, it rather finished something else, and formalized rather a military system that had already been forming now for more than 1 century, and that had fully developed. The Marian reform is in fact mainly a kind of a political and organizational, administrative reform. It's not really a truly military one, right? There is this historiographical tradition that sees into Marius this great reform, and he really was actually that changed literally everything about the Roman equipment, etc. But as a matter of fact, that's mostly attributed, and that's just a historical memory was maintained to stress the importance that Marius had, not just as a reformer, but as a politician, as a general, as you know. But as a matter of fact, the Roman legion at that point didn't quite change a big deal, right? Many people presume that the Marian reform basically opened the path to what the Roman army would become later, mostly in early imperial times, which is what people are mostly interested in. But actually, it wasn't much of a great change compared to what had happened already since centuries and what the Roman legion was essentially at the end of the day, because these weren't radically different military systems. As we have said many times, also the rest of the militaries of the world were obviously different from the Roman. Well, the Roman one was truly unique, right? But there wasn't also a big deal of difference in the essentials, right? And really what made the difference was, for Rome, was anything the degree of organization, of coordination, of discipline, of availability of resources that the Romans could put into the field at that point. So starting in here from a moment specifically is kind of difficult, because also in here we should explain, in order to understand how we arrived to the late Roman army, about the manipular army. That was what formerly remained in standing up to the Marian reform, that actually also in here never actually changed, never actually dismissed properly the manipular one, right? Because the maniples kept existing within the cohorts, and that were just basically 3 maniples put together, and that had already been in use way far, even 1 century before actually Marius. Seemingly they were experimented by Scipio in Spain during the Second Punic War, and actually also why, for example, the cohort was one. I mean, these are deep questions and should be answered. We will answer them progressively, step by step, as we do on Schwerpunkt. The idea is really a deep change within the Roman Republic, in politics and society, of course, rather before than the military one, right? Basically, the Roman, the middle Republican legion is what also we call the Polybian legion, that because it's been described in quite a bit of detail by the Hellenic historian Polybius, that went to Rome and wrote about the Roman army and a lot of stuff, and that rendered us this very modern, very clear, just like the Greek historiography could do at the time, picture of Roman army. Otherwise, about which otherwise we wouldn't know much, right? Read Polybius, it's an extraordinary read, etc. Polybius is a bit positivistic. He kind of makes ideal pictures sometimes, because he pretends, he was writing on behalf of someone that wanted, naturally from the Roman side, to draw a picture was naturally brighter, also especially in political terms, than what it really was at the time. Actually, that was the moment of the deepest crisis of the military recruitment in the Roman army. It was a kind of a terrible time that accelerated, and was a symptom actually of the decline of the republican institutions as they had been known, and which is the manipular system. The manipular legion, that is the bit of the iconic one. The famous triplex Accius. The idea that it was basically 3,600 men in a legion, 300 cavalry. At least this was the Roman citizen legion. Then there were the Italic allies that were a bit different. They had kind of a triple number of cavalry. They had kind of also relatively different military traditions. By the end of the 3rd century BC, they had grown pretty good, pretty well homogeneous. If I'm not wrong, it's Livy or Polybius, maybe in some of the states, basically, that the Italics were indistinguishable from the rest, from the Roman citizens at this point in terms of equipment on the field. That already tells a lot. And the triplex Accius is basically this 3 ranks formation. The whole legion was 30 maniples, right? That would remain as such also during with the Marian reform, and there were these 3 ranks by 1,200 each, and therefore 10 maniples each. The famous Astati, Principes, and Triarii. And then this basically scattered skirmishers that didn't properly have a rank were the velites, right? They were the skirmishers of religion, and this turma of cavalry, or the equites, right? And this system was based fundamentally on a political and social segmentation that, ideally the thing is a bit more complicated than this, but the first ranks were the youngest people. They were usually the poorer people, and the thing was being accelerated in their terms, meaning that in the origins of this system that dates back like far, kind of before. It was actually the Manipular religion was properly the Camillian legion, the one that had been allegedly created by Furius Camillus. Actually, it was kind of developed very slowly during the 4th century, between in fact 390, the Battle of the Alde River, and the I think the Second Samnite War. Definitely by the end of the 4th century, by 311, 310, I remember, BC, the Libyan legion described is basically the full Manipular legion as it was developed, and this was changing a lot. Also, in fact, the 4th century, even the equipment was changing brutally. Initially, the Roman troops were equipped basically with spears, then they passed to with the famous swords, and so on. So I promise we will deal with all this stuff. I'm sorry I'm digressing so much, but just to make you understand how actually more articulate, complex, and complicated this story is. Also, we know very few about the Roman military. Don't think that we know actually how the systems worked, how they operated on the field. We basically know nothing about the Roman army, and this is something that is not only shared with all of kind of the armies that existed at the time. And we're particularly well documented on the Romans, of course, but our knowledge is. But for us, as much as we know, there were such complicated transformations. So then there were the principes that were kind of the more mature men that had this kind of medium equipment that would incidentally be the model as a balanced form, basically, for the Marian legionary. We can't call it in this way, but we will explain also better now what had happened, because that was not a Marian legionary, but that's how the average Manipular soldier had come to be equipped throughout the 2nd century BC, all by itself, without needing to wait for Marius. And then the Triarii, that were this basically the elderly and the rich ones, were maintained. The spears were this kind of heavy defensive troops, however, basically declined over time. And but also here we can't make the full story. So this political social segmentation is torn apart, because this system was fundamentally based on the idea of the citizen slash peasant slash, say, farmer better, slash soldier of the Roman system. There is this comparison that also happened in Polybius, confronting during the Punic Wars what the fact that the acme, the functionality of Carthaginian society had already been passed. The Romans instead were at their peak, and indeed the Second Punic War does represent the moments of the fullest and the full maturity of the Manipular system that goes beyond the starts becoming something else, but chiefly because the Roman society starts becoming something else. The Second Punic War has been terrible. Roman has consumed lots of resources. This very long war, the citizens, the peasantry has impoverished, and fundamentally the ancient classes of recruitment, as they were in fact reflected by the segmentation in triplex Accius, come to be apart, right? And this is a very painful process, because it passes through, in fact, the generation of same Roman institutions, etc., brings to the crisis of the 2nd century BC. Rome at this point is actually expanding pretty well around the Mediterranean, with this Manipular legion that now the Romans know how to operate fully. Even though here I have, that they about which they know their full potential. Also, in here we should understand how much it took for the same Romans to evolve the system, and how and what it was capable of. But it's a long story, so I will have to make lots of other videos about it to explain it fully. The point, though, is that wars after wars that start becoming, also after the great successes, also wars of maintainment and also defensive wars, sometimes crushing this rebellion, this other, start wearing out the fabric of the Roman and Italic society. And basically the old ideal of the soldier that provided with for his own equipment, participating to the army in kind of a privileged sense as a citizen, is totally collapsed, right? These soldiers come back home, they don't find their farms functional anymore, their families went to ruin, the economy is shattered. So there's a big deal of social certification that makes this, a very few rich people at the top, the senators, and then this multitude of what they will be called basically the proletari, that were those that didn't hold anything else essentially but their own family, their own children. So that would become instead the bulk of within the same Roman citizenry, as a matter of fact, of the late Republican legions at the end of the day, because that's what it was. Always remember that the legion, the citizen legion here, is properly the Roman, is recruited among Roman citizens, right? The Italics that also have their citizenry extended to them, many become fully Romans, that now it's something that you can identify all over Italy proper, and so there is not a difference anymore at the end of the day. Naturally, there are kind of different belongings, different feelings, that there is the social war at the beginning of the 1st century BC. So it's a very messed up story in many ways, but the process of Romanization is very, very advanced, right? And it's often a clash between elites. The people themselves do not have largely this capacity to intervene as autonomous classes, like autonomous political power into the matters here, and they start filling the ranks of the great, have been called the warlords, right? And the best example is at the very end of the Republic, let's say, with figures like Caesar's, Pompey, or Crassus. But something that had already began and that Marius basically formalizes, even though this change had already taken place, right? There are lots of people who basically have nothing to lose that start joining the army on a regular basis on these campaigns overseas, often in Greece or Asia Minor, but especially in Spain. Spain is a place that really changes a lot of things. Spain is a bit the Vietnam of the Romans. Like, the Romans obviously win at the end, but it takes them centuries to conquer this pretty hostile and difficult territory that consumes these resources. And the crisis of the military, the Roman recruitment happens, in fact, during the 2nd century BC, chiefly because of the resources that are required for maintaining Spain. Right, it's quite a big deal. Nobody basically wanted to join the military anymore. They didn't have the money. Abandoning their farms would have meant to lose them to join the army. So there is this disruption of the recruitment system where you can see even, the consuls not really waiting for people to come to Rome to join the army, but actually going literally into the countryside, chasing, hunting down the peasants that hid themselves not to be recruited, and to be recruited forcibly. They even lay at the hand over tribunes, was something unheard up to that point. So all things that we will see in dedicated videos. As a consequence, though, basically the idea is that the military starts becoming a profession, right? Up to that point, as we have seen, basically the Roman army is definable as a sort of militia, right? For which there are the citizens that join in case of war for more or less a long time, and that theoretically can do it, occasionally, but theoretically repeatedly. As we have seen, that base didn't quite exist anymore. So, but there were lots of impoverished people that didn't know what to do with their lives, so they joined the military because they thought it was a way to make to have a living, right? To be in a place that was starting evenly already to centralize a little bit the actual military administration was able to provide equipment. Here at this point, basically, no Roman citizens could afford anymore, because it was like a damn, loss of blood, economically speaking. And the at the end of the day, these people joined the military to make a living out of it, right, and to remain under the army of the this leaders that were obviously into politics, also because you couldn't lead an army otherwise, and that had, however, considerably enormous private resources that they employed also to fuel to upgrade their own armies that were starting to become not really a statal army, but more of a private army, right? Hence the idea of the warlords of the late Roman Republic. So this triggers a lot of changes, because those who join the military obviously expect to be rewarded with loot, etc. But also they have no other place to go to. So these guys are becoming professionals, right? They're becoming people who make literally a living throughout all their life into these legions. The recruitment system still doesn't manage to absorb them up to a certain point, because theoretically Roman legions at this point were not permanent, which means that every conflict, every war, every campaign, basically they fought, they did what they have to do, and then they came back home and they were disbanded, right? And all these people would remain without a job until the next military operation. Now, naturally, the next campaign, the next army was formed. So this phase is quite blurred, because we can't see clearly all how it happened. Really, we have difficulties to really trace all of these changes. We know they happened, but we don't actually, we can't see the details about them. And as a consequence, however, there were lots of people who basically joined these military expeditions on a regular basis, but they had, for example, to restart from scratch in the military career. There were pretty damn fine centurions who, once the army was disbanded, they were no ones, and then they were rehired before the next campaign. That they had to rise through the ranks once again. So this was definitely a moment of transformation that was evidently achieved at one point. Probably, if anything, if the Marian reform has really changed something in depth, probably was literally about these things. We know more about centurions from really the second half of the first century, like the mid-first century BC, with Caesar, that incidentally writes a lot about them, and that shows in this sense their importance, and what these NCOs had become, and also what the importance of an army that was definitely professional at this point. And this triggers a lot of other problems, chiefly about how these armies were practically levied. Just right now we have said about the private resources that were invested by the various consuls, proconsuls, in order to equip their own armies. Originally speaking, it was the Senate that basically entrusted public money to the hands of the consuls, that at that point provided to levy an army on their own. So it's obvious that there was already this theoretically private interference, for which even Rome at this point didn't, for example, have a centralized army weaponry production, for example, and it starts happening already from, in fact, after Marius. At least with the first evidence we have from from statal manufacturers for providing weapons and armor to the legionaries is the time of Cicero, and these were actually privates that were conventioned with the state to produce armies. You can think in here also the corruption, the interests, the investments. So it was a world that was really crumbling in terms of the institutions and the public authority. The Senate barely was losing. In fact, all the control and the rest of the provinces that were now in the hands of these great warlords. So the point, however, though, is that there was the development of a new military that was fully now on a professional base, right? The soldiers start properly being paid. Theoretically, then it will remain up to the early Roman Empire and beyond. Actually, at least in theory, the idea that the soldiers didn't quite receive money as an active form of income, but just for repaying their own equipment that theoretically they had to provide by themselves. And largely even the means of providement of the equipment were something similar. Sometimes soldiers were just given money to equip themselves, or they could buy something somewhere else. The Roman army had also been equipped sometimes by the allies locally. Here are all the problems of the standardization and the uniformation in a certain sense that also we don't quite cover. If not for the fact that there is an evident tactical uniformation at this point. Like the Marian Legionary, as you know, is now a unique figure, right? There is not anymore the traditional differences that existed in the triplex Achaeus. All of the Roman legionnaires are equipped with basically a coat of mail and a helmet, a sword, some pila, that were basically these heavy javelins, a scutum, and then of course other gear that they needed even to bring things with them. Think about the figure of the Marian mule that now was theoretically a soldier that had to bring literally all of his equipment, like up to 40 kilos of stuff on his back. This is also a bit of a myth, meaning that the Romans always moved like any other army in the world in history with things like carts and other means of transportation. But for example, this anecdote, what it really means is that the soldiers were now issued with this form of pretty damn heavy training that was extremely intensive, extremely brutal, and that really shaped this extremely disciplined and cold-blooded military machine that was able to annihilate like half of the world at the time. And so this is probably the greatest change of all. It's not a matter of what weapons they were using. Erase it from your mind. The big deal is not the weapon. It's not even the uniformation. It's really about the professionalization, which means that you actually make a living out of killing people by profession, which is what a soldier is and what they had to do here. And an ancient warfare was plain butchery, like it was literally a bath of blood. And this man, I don't know, it would have been very interesting to psychoanalyze, because naturally, our modern military has now, we know a lot of things about how human mind works, and there are certain very different scenarios that require different training. But the ancient military was really that rough and that tough as you can get, in ways that are not that different, of course, from our own, but with, for example, for completely different ethics than with it. Like at the time, the universal ethics shared literally by every single people in the world was the idea of conquering the rest of the world, and drawing pride for the idea of standing on your enemy's corpse and and looting, pillaging, and doing all the worst things about him, because basically that was a divine gift, right? The ancients believed that that victory and glory did not belong to men. They belonged to the gods. So if you won, it was because the gods were with you. And basically that was the ultimate form of justification, even in moral terms, that was universally accepted in a world that hasn't changed. As you know, war remains substantially the same even today, but at that time was that explicitly, violently oriented, right? So the question is, why did really the Roman legion at this point had evolved in this kind of uniform fashion, for which there was practically no difference anymore between the usual troops, like the social segmentation. Well, the answer lays naturally in the same political and social change. Like if you have at this point, that segmentation in the Manipular Legion had corresponded to literally the fact that soldiers had to provide their own equipment to go to war with it. It's a bit theoretical also in here because I have difficulties to imagine any time in Roman history, which is in any other history for that matter, in which people literally went to war with, the stuff that, that they had grown or produced in their own farm, and that's it. It's obvious that wherever you have even in a tribe, a certain form of centralization, you have, the chieftain shares weapons and organizes the supplies and so on. So the Roman military had undergone these types of changes, administratively speaking, a lot of centuries from. The majority of soldiers, however, could afford their own equipment up to that point. When you don't have that base anymore, you have now this public/private, interestingly enough, resources that have to keep basically a pretty identical type of soldier. That is a guy who comes literally with nothing in his pockets. That has to be equipped, right? And this is a way, it's useless at that point to specialize, particularly into different types, especially of infantry that are conceptually also basically the same thing. Like even if you look in the Manipular system at the peak of its development, that is incidentally when you start immediately to, exactly at that point to see this kind of uniformation in turn, so it's kind of a decline. You see that even Anastatus and a Triarius, for example, are not excessively different. Like the Anastatus is, we want to say, light infantry. Well, for ancient warfare standards, that's light, but it's fairly more towards medium, right? The Triarius also is a kind of a very heavy guy for ancient warfare standards, but still basically heavy infantry. So this idea that's still infantry that has to engage in melee, that is different from cavalry, that is different from skirmishers, is already conceptually there. Secondly, you have new tactical employments, new tactical environments, right? And this is very important. That is something you see basically in every form of passage from kind of militia, seasonal warfare into professional, permanent warfare, right? It's the idea that at one point you have to employ these troops in situations that, whether you like them or not, are going to be so messed up that you have to rely on each one of these soldiers without too many changes. Like the Manipular system, theoretically, as we've seen, evolves from this kind of phalanx, let's say, system that is very different from actually the Hellenic one or even the Macedonian one, in spite of what certain people believe, especially compared to the first model. The Romans really never fought like the Greeks did. This is also very, very, very important to remember. It's never been like that. But it was the idea, it was basically this frontal deployment with this, we can't say just in a tribal context anymore, but the Manipular system develops initially in situations with the Romans were fighting partly against the Gauls, partly against the Samnites, so either Italics, not really with much aid of anyone. So it was a kind of, fighting against neighbors in some way, more or less distant neighbors. And in situations that were a bit more regulated, a bit more, ritualized, even though the Romans are going far beyond this. When you have conflicts like the Second Punic War, you have to rely on troops now that have to be detached from the central base, like of recruitment, etc., for hundreds and hundreds of miles for entire years in environments that are completely different from yours, against populations that you've never seen, against enemies that are pretty damn advanced in terms of military, in terms of tactics, etc. So the idea is that you need flexibility. You need something that goes beyond the more or less unwieldy manipulator legion as it had developed from the origins, and something that has to work a bit better. Like, that's why we talk about full maturity of the manipulator system only during the Second Punic War, because basically it's only under Nero first and Scipio later that you have, for the first time in Roman military, an actual wanted and effectively carried out maneuver of, for example, flanking with these troops, because otherwise Manipulator Legion originally had never, had always engaged frontally. They didn't have that level of collective training that is necessary to carry out more complex maneuvers. And the fact that the Romans began to carry out these tactics during the Second Punic War, either it tells you that probably something was already changing from before, or at least that the moment was favorable that to catch this, to gather this fruit now, this tactical fruit. But when you need all that flexibility, it means that you need troops that are naturally much more trained, and this is valid for, like, I don't know, the Spanish veterans, or that the Scipio had under his command, that had seen all that war, that had been under arms for years in that scenario, and that therefore were naturally experienced and could carry out those. But at that point you need, in fact, also a way these troops can be employed readily, kind of at every moment. So at that point, the ancient division between the various classes, especially on the field, and how these troops were equipped by the commander, doesn't function anymore. I mean, why should I have one guy that has just a small breastplate and a guy that has a full cuirass, when I can have, everybody, like the middle guy, with a coat of mail, that is basically the optimum, the balanced version of the soldier, right? It can perform most of the tasks. It's enough agile, but also enough protected. It's a compromise, right? So that's how the thing begins to transition. And naturally, when you don't have the traditional recruitment functioning anymore, you need to equip these guys from scratch. You would keep using that form of equipment because you know that's what you can do mostly with. Naturally, bearing in mind that in parallel there was probably an increase in training proper, right? So that these troops were starting now to remain more under arms and to be trained, and therefore getting more experience and being trained constantly, right? So it's something that it starts becoming basically what it was, even the prototype of the Marian or the Augustan Legionary, right? So that's in a nutshell how this change occurred, right? And it occurred spontaneously. Like there was never a guy, who sit at a table and thought, okay, from now on we change the thing. These things started because they were needed immediately on the field, right? This thing also operates, for example, at an organic level because of the cohort. Like the cohort is, as we've said before, is the sum of these three maniples. So naturally, every legion has 10 cohorts with 30 maniples, and it's basically a larger body, substantial body of troops that now grow kind of homogeneous, even though the administrative repartition in the three ranks remains within the same cohort, because basically the cohort took those three maniples were on the same row, let's say, with maintaining the segmentation, 1/3 of stati, 1/3 principes, and 1/3 triarii, right? So the idea is that you have this thick body of, at this point, it would be 400, it would be 360 theoretically, but let's say between the Camillian Legion, so the Manipular Legion, and the Marian Legion, there is an increase, progressive increase of the number of the Centuriae, or of the sentries, if you prefer. It seems that because the Centuria, every Centuria was like 60 men, it seems that we don't actually know with certainty, but it seems from the Second Punic War, at least the Centuriae of the Astati and the Principes were augmented up to 80 against Hannibal. And basically, in fact, you find the average Roman legion, both the Marian one and the Augustan one, that has a body of 4,800 legionary infantry. So there's an increase also in the number of this heavy infantry. There's also another factor that triggers the increase of this solid bulk of homogeneous heavy infantry. Is the fact that over the 2nd century BC, the Romans start using always more auxiliaries, right? Up to the 3rd century BC, the Roman legionary the forces had always been flanked by the Italic allies that had this very solid bulk of cavalry, as we've seen. The same legions had the skirmishers, for example, the Veditas, as we've seen. Then Romans and Italics blend, because basically Italics become Romans as citizens as well. So basically there's no difference at that point anymore. But the Veditas disappear, for example. The cavalry element remains basically the same. At least that larger number of cavalry that the Italics brought is reduced, kind of Roman standards. This naturally reduces the capabilities of the legion, meant just as that bulk of citizen troops on the field, also strategically speaking. But no worries now, because the Romans have conquered now a lot of Mediterranean, and they have lots of foreigners that can serve them as allies, right? Think about the Numidians, think about the Gauls, the Iberians. It's plenty of troops from literally everywhere that they start operating now, like the throwaway cheap troops. So this mostly light infantry or light cavalry that is vital, however, for advancing, skirmishing, devastating, exploring, stuff like that. And the body of Roman legionary infantry becomes instead the base now of something else, so something that is also tactically employed, despite remaining very flexible for many contexts, mostly open, like in pitched battles, right? This heavy infantry as an element, either fighting other big masses of enemies in open field, or assaulting fortresses, stuff like that. Most of the rest is done by the auxiliaries, right? That are kind of ethnic troops that have their own military specialties. At this point, the Romans hired a lot of Cretans, a lot of Balearic slingers. They're even the Balearic slingers during this period in 1st century BC are even attached to the Roman legionnaires. To the Roman legions are kind of a fixed body of troops. Something that began very early with them. Caesar brought them, for example, into Gaul, etc. So you can understand the direction here, right? Also, there is a solid bulk of heavy legionary infantry, legionary heavy infantry, and then all these other troops around that gravitate around it and that pave the road for them, right? So this is what, on the long run, brings these troops to be, and at this point they're being paid by the state proper, right? They receive kind of a fixed money that is theoretically always the compensation for military expenses, but that starts to become more and more like a salary, and that's why the proletarians join in the army. That Marius also has this popular is a from the side of the populares, the one that also the Caesar would follow. There is all this kind of idea that also the proletarians, for example, can join the army. This has nothing to do. It's not like today's liberals, for example. It's simply the Roman elite had all a common aim. It was just a different way of achieving it, right? So it's not that Marius cared very much at the end of the day about these things, but he understood naturally the potential that ambitious men like him could obtain if he could legalize the hiring of all these masses of these inherited individuals that could join basically the general who paid them, because that was the point. And that's why these clienteles, by the way, were so damn faithful to their commanders, and why this warlords become so dominating into politics, and they take over basically the republic, and they because they have all the solid bulk of troops and money, of course, that with which they can pay the soldiers on their shoulders, right? So this change is very meaningful because naturally, more than for the Republic, these troops start fighting for their patrons, and they start doing increasingly that function. For we were talking about the cohort, and talking about the cohort, the concept is that probably we don't know much about how the cohort was practically born. Scipio had used it in order to carry out those complex flanking maneuvers during the Spanish and African campaign that were pretty damn effective, and were based. There's this concept of simplicity. You need lots of men who know exactly what they have to do, and they can move together in a solid mass and perform this maneuver, right? The cohort is further enhanced during the 2nd century BC, probably for other reasons, probably in Spain. Spain, as we've said, was a hell of a territory, was one of the first provinces that the Romans built outside of Italy, or at least its immediate nearbys. It was a tough ground, constant rebellions, constant guerrilla. Was a very difficult territory to control. So what the Romans did was starting to deploy these legions, scattered in separated, with subdivisions, all scattered around like garrisons. And probably the cohort is further enhanced through this process, right? So that instead of having one legion concentrated, there you have all 10 cohorts scattered a bit everywhere. This naturally increases also the need of homogenization, because basically you need that cohort to function exactly like a combat-ready force that had to move to deal with all problems, like kind of without further internal differences, and probably also increases the capabilities of connection, of the idea of rejoining with other troops, complex maneuvers, with marches, with this ability that is both offensive and defensive at the same time. So this is more or less how things occur. Marius, at the end of the 2nd century BC, simply formalizes all of these changes. Right? The most important thing he does is simply legalizes the access of the proletari into the army. End of the story. All the military changes that had existed were like the same, right? Marius was a very competent general, a very successful commander. As you know, he spent a lifetime as a military commander, and it's plausible that he changed something else also in how the army was regulated. But even these inventions, like how soldiers had to carry their stuff, etc., it's not that Marius invented them. There is no need for that. These were things that the Romans did since centuries, that at this point maybe were revived or consolidated finally as a standard, but that was already there. Always bear it in mind. Marius was a great man in many ways, but he didn't literally change the way soldiers had to bear the shield, not to make the bang against their legs, right? We are that minimal intelligent not to believe something like that. I believe that this change this is a massive change, naturally, into Roman politics and society that triggers, incidentally, the same end of the Republic. And that yet paves the road for the most iconic Roman military that we know, right? Especially in organizational form. Was there any change also in the equipment in terms of, the armor? Well, not slightly, right? Yes, slightly. Here, the Roman equipment, first of all, we have to think of one thing. It was, what does it mean to be standardized or uniform, right? Because at this point, there is no way to make literally standardized equipment. You can naturally start producing weapons and armor en masse and with a certain degree of uniformity, but still every soldier can, for example, with his own pay, buy an army. Not an army, but an equipment, or steal it from a fallen enemy. There was probably some regulation. Spoils of war were managed by the commanders, etc. But the idea is that there were many ways in which a Roman soldier could look in some other fashion than the one we're, usually proposed. The iconic thing of this age is the Montefortino helmet, which is basically like a cap, like a dome, a bowl. Very easy. It's something you find in this Celtic Italic world since centuries. It's mildly protective. It's cheap. It does what it has to do. There are cheek protections added over time, kind of a bit larger. The helmet still has a crest, very long crest. Is something that most warriors had at the time. The Italics had emerged from this kind of tribal background from relatively very few centuries. There was the lorica amata, so this coat of mail that was protected pretty well, especially against cutting weapons from neck to or better from shoulders to, at this point, to the thighs. It seems that substantial, one of the few changes that occurred into the legionary equipment at this point was the extension of the lorica amata length from the waist up to the thighs, which means more protection needed for whichever reason. Also, now we've explained why. There is seemingly an extra layer of mail over the shoulders that was also hinged in front of the chest. Then, as we have said before, there was this sword. At this point, basically, there is no spear, theoretically at least, anymore, even though they were actually still used. The spear is something you can find everywhere on a battlefield, and it's obviously not so strange that a Roman legionary would use it at this point, but the issued weapon was the sword. Talking about the sword, the famous Gladius Hispaniensis, so the Spanish sword in Latin, that is a hell of a weapon, actually, and many people assume that it was all about the Gladius, why the Romans conquered the world, but it's not really like that. Yet this was a weapon that was particularly, was fitted, actually, for tactics. We'll also always remember in military history that tactics are definitely influenced by technology, but technology is mostly influenced by tactics. And basically, many people assume that it was just a thrusting, not a cutting weapon. This is also a pretty big mistake, actually. It was both, and it was pretty damn efficient in both ways. It was a pretty damn good compromise. And the very origins of this sword have to be found into basically into the Celtiberian, actually, background. But these are basically swords that evolved from the Latin culture, right? So they were straight from Central Europe and the Celtic world at the time. They were cutting weapons, chiefly cutting weapons, and there were similar. The Celtiberians basically had blended a little bit this model already with the Iberian falcata. It was very close to the copis. It was a very long, massive, not really knife, but it's kind of a dagger, but very, shaped in a way that it was pretty damn good to cut, to really, literally, could cut like a limb very, very easily. Very also good for cavalry use. The Romans basically take this blade that they allegedly met like massively in the first time with like when they went to Spain to fight against the Carthaginians, and that in fact was absorbed at that point in the Roman army. Scipio gave it especially to the Velites to augment their own kind of assault capabilities, and you realize also in here that the Velites are not really just plain skirmishers anymore, something more already in there. Maybe also the Velites were absorbed into the average medium infantry at that point, but by certain standards, of course. And they basically doubled the shape of this blade so that it becomes symmetrical, because the Iberian falcata is not symmetrical. Symmetrical as the Gladius Hispaniensis in fact emerges like, right? So it's basically a fusion between a Celtic sword and this type of swords that actually existed all over the Mediterranean at that point, in a way that it's pretty damn good to cut, but it's also pretty damn good to trust. And now the problem what it is and why there is so much confusion also about the Gladius Hispaniensis is that basically the Romans over the centuries changed the shape of this sword. Basically towards the early empire, like the first and especially the 2nd century AD, the Gladius has become effectively more like of a trusting sword, right? Especially the Pompey type, if I'm not wrong. That is more similar to a stock, right? And the reason why this happened is that especially legionary infantry was fighting kind of an increasingly compact mass, for which slashing and cutting in this sense was kind of more difficult, and thrusting was more effective. But at the end of the day, the Gladius remained still a cutting weapon, generally speaking. And what is very often forgotten in this picture is that, well, first of all, during these first years, these last centuries of the Republic, the Gladius remains largely kind of more of a similar thing to a Celtic sword than to this kind of with this cutting capability, just in a thrusting one. If you look at the archaeological samples, you can see it very well. I don't know why, some reconstructions like to show a lot this kind of leaf-shaped sword, like a similar bit to the Hellenic xiphos, but actually, Roman swords at this time were pretty damn kind of long and straight as blades. So anyhow, but secondly, the fact that, for example, cavalry throughout all this period, from the late Republic to early modern times, kept using this kind of relatively long. The Gladius is not particularly long, but kind of on the Celtic model that theoretically is for the cavalry, right? So that eventually that type of sword melts into the spada model that is often like was basically the Germanic sword of the later Roman Empire, that incidentally was derived from the same Celtic Latin swords back in the day, because the Germans basically took most of their metallurgy and weapon production under that point of view from the Celts themselves, right? So both the Romans and the Germans shared this stuff. And it's very important to look at this Gladius together with the rest of the equipment, because that really makes you understand a lot of things also here that are often either overlooked or misunderstood openly about the Roman Legionnaire. So if you have a sword that can both cut and thrust, well, that tells you that this, first of all, is a soldier that can really do a freaking lot of things on the battlefield. If you take this scutum, this is a pretty massive thing. the shield, right? This is the scutum is properly seemingly Italic derived. It doesn't have seemingly Celtic origins, as sometimes is said. It developed in Italy. Surely the Celts had similar things, but it seems that there is different types of weapons and equipments develop in parallel. And after all, there's not so many ways you can make a shield. But the scutum is kind of an oblong, oval shaped and convex form. So it's basically a shield. It weighs a lot. It weighs like 8 kilos. Now I ask you to try to even lift a luggage that weighs like 8 kilos and try to keep it up from the ground and see what happens. It makes you understand what it needed in terms of training, even to handle this equipment. So it's massive. It's multi-layered wood with some even leather over, because there is all this kind of face. The leather, sorry, it's the cover that often the shields were covered with. There is an umbo naturally in the front to protect the hand, and can also be used offensively to punch the enemy literally in the face. And it's a pretty damn good shield. It has an enveloping form, basically covers most of your torso, right? Your torso and parts of your legs as well. And it has a mostly individualistic function, right? When this is often misunderstood, people assume that basically the convex shield is somewhat better to forms, for example, some of collective formation, right? This is absolutely wrong. The best way to make things like a shield war, for example, is a flat shield, right? And a flat shield, in this sense, the reasons you have to make a shield wall actually do not tell excessively much about what your quality as a trained soldier really is, because especially a good individually trained soldier is usually individualistic minded, right? And that was incidentally what the Roman legionary was. Many people say, oh well, the Roman legionary couldn't fight outside formation, it was conceived just to fight into formation. Well, actually no, this is not true. The Roman legionary is born conceptually as an Italic warrior point, and most of the Roman equipment will remain essentially that conceptually. You don't have things like a phalanx where the soldiers just have to stick together, because that formation is all what makes the unity of the formation is all what makes the difference, right? It has just to handle a pike or being in keeping the order. The Roman legionnaire, albeit trained, pretty damn well trained in collective formation, is also kind of individualistically oriented, right? On the battlefield, we don't know much of how the Romans actually fought, and if you find someone who tells you how, for example, Roman formations operated on the field, just know that he's or she's a liar, because nobody on this earth knows, because these are universally unknown and unknowable topics, because nobody has the palest idea of how a Roman legion functioned on the field, right? And if you don't know what I'm talking about, just know that it's because you don't know about it enough. But it's obvious for this form of equipment that the possibilities of this soldier were definitely pretty wide, and there is a very aggressive intention in there, right? The idea is that if you have a convex shield, you can hide behind it and act as a monad in a kind of an individual fashion, right? Romans fought in formation. It was all mostly about collective formation, with a training and discipline that most of the peoples didn't have, because they didn't have a state who could give them that discipline, who didn't have political structures to cooperate together to increase collective training, unless they were some sort of mercenaries or something. So that's what really makes the difference of the Roman legion, especially on the field. Then naturally the effectiveness of the Roman legion stays in logistics, engineeristic skills, resources, sheer resources that the Romans could afford at the time, and more, that extra more that maybe we will talk about in our time about what really was conceptually the Roman Empire and the Roman Republic altogether, because the Roman Empire always remained a republic, namely, like up to the Dominatus actually, and even. But the imperium is a different thing. Imperium is not an institutional form. It's like it's a faculty that is proper of certain Roman magistrates because of divine mandate. But this is another story. So this means that, and there are passages that actually say that the Roman legionary, if properly equipped, can basically fight in every condition, everywhere, right? And the Roman legionary is pretty damn good individual fighter as well. It might be not as good as like a Celtic nobleman, because that objectively had a higher individualistic training, but the point is that the Celtic nobleman got butchered down like a ham simply because his clan didn't have enough collective training like a Roman cohort could have, right? So that's the biggest difference. So never think that individual training is superior in practice to collective training, because it's the other way around. Secondly, though, never presume that the Romans ever got rid of their kind of warrior mentality, in spite of their kind of modernization as a military system. They were always about, and this is largely true for most of the ancient world, right? They were deeply, religiously motivated, and they had this vision of the world for which the individualistic pride of the warrior was a fundamental, ineliminable element for the warrior ethics at the time, even in the most trained and disciplined armies. Right? You find this in the Roman army. They had this stasis even for decapitations, for certain kind of individualistic exploit that were pretty risky but still pretty appreciated, right? By despite it, as stupid as they can be, right? Because that's what puts the formation in danger. But still, the bravery is there. Like the concept is very strongly rooted into Roman culture. So passing, and then they have other equipment naturally. There are in terms of clothing, there are the various. There are the breeches that at this time start appearing because the Romans venture in kind of colder climates, and this myth that they went bare-legged is a bit of a excessive. The Romans spread a lot of propaganda about themselves, that including the fact that they could replicate other people's knowledge and techniques and tactics, because and weaponry mostly, because that's a Roman invention, right? If you believe that, it's not because you're actually, it's because you still fall in the trap of imperial Roman propaganda rather than knowing about, in fact, documentary archaeological evidence. That tells you how strongly we are influenced by the Roman world as a whole. But aside from this, naturally, the Romans start evolving here into kind of heavier infantry on average. This starts happening for chiefly the increase in the availability of resources, the Roman world as a whole. From the mid first century BC, it seems that even segmented armor starts getting around. Like the first finds are probably the ones associated at Calcrise with the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. But for that armor to have been there surely from some decade, it was already not known, right? So there would be nothing strange if you saw, I don't know, during the Gallic Wars or the civil wars of Rome with kind of segmented armor, even if we don't have direct evidence of that. Because also in here, changes are slow, right? It's not that technology here speeds up, accelerates in a way that you can't keep track of it. It's obvious that certain concepts are always there. You just have to implement them or to render them necessary. But it's obvious that, for example, the Augustan the Roman Augustan army has much more wealth to invest, and there are even this kind of heavier equipment. Caesarian legionnaires in Gaul naturally fight for 8 years constantly against Celtic peoples, and they absorb their weaponry, if anything, through loot and to these depots that they find, and that's not necessarily because they think that Celtic stuff it's better than them, but because it's there and it's functional. Sometimes it's really better than theirs, but that's not really the big deal. It's not really the big difference. Romans didn't win because they had Celtic weapons. Otherwise, they would have not even conquered Gaul at that point. The point is that they start absorbing the stuff in contexts that were making it possible. And as I always say, the myth of cultural appropriation is actually very poor, because if you are able to absorb someone's know-how or intelligence or experience, it's actually because you're already at the level of that person. Because if you're not at the level of that person already, you can't absorb this stuff, you can't understand them, you can't apply them properly. So the ability in which the Romans managed to do this is that they were already pretty damn advanced on their own. And this is something extremely difficult for people to understand, because people normally understand that it's technology that changes history, while it's history that changes technology. It's the other way around. What else can we say? There's the pugium, or pugium if you prefer. This short dagger that was used like a small side weapon. And there is the pilum, right? So this heavy javelin, sorry, that has an obvious function as such, but that is very famous into Roman hands because of the degree of collective training that rendered available this concerted use of the pilum, right? So the Romans usually had two pila. One was lighter, one was heavier, and they were conceived to basically hit at different distances, right? And this was done during the same charge. This is a very important chapter also to explain. First of all, a bit of prehistory of the pilum. The pilum is really in itself really nothing special, right? The Romans implemented, obviously over time, to make it very functional, to make it in a way basically it gets broken when it enters into the enemy's shield, so it can't be taken out, it becomes an hindrance, etc. But actually, and what is often overlooked, is that every single people in the world use javelins, and also heavy javelins, right? So there is actually nothing particularly different in origin between the Roman pilum and any other heavy javelin, right? They were used also by even the Libo-Phoenician infantry used heavy javelins. That it was kind of normal. The obvious reason for using these weapons, both on an individual or collective level, is to soften up the enemy ranks and to eventually charge them. Most of ancient battles were about skirmishing. It's universally known that humans can't fight more than like 5 minutes in a row, and then 5 minutes they're already exhausted, right? So most of battles were actually fought with skirmishes, and skirmishes keep enemy under pressure, etc. What you can have with an army that starts becoming at that level, so professional like the Roman one, is you just can start to make a more efficient use of these javelins. This, for example, doesn't develop into the Hellenistic tradition, because the Hellenistic tradition was based on completely different basis. It was fundamentally, as you know, emerging literally from the Hellenic phalanx and developing as such, and mostly being fascinated with this more than with its defensivism more than its aggressivism. That's one reason why, for example, the Romans called their units with the name of their weapons, while the Greeks with the name of their shields, right? But the Romans start using the pila, which is the plural of pilum, in a concerted effort. We're not excessively documented on how this happened, so much is speculation. But the concept was to exploit this rain of heavy javelins in all one shot. Not much in defense, as is also in thought. There is only one evidence of a defensive use of the pila. That is during, I think, against the Belgians in the Bello Gallico, that because the Romans at that point, they were kind of in a favorable position, so they start throwing their pila from the above, like with all the gravitational acceleration and all to facilitate that. So it's obvious, you can use a javelin wherever you like. But actually, all the other mentions are in attack during a charge, not before the charge, right? A heavy javelin also doesn't have this enormous range. What was the objective? Well, the objective was basically charging, throwing these two slungs of pila at once. First the lighter pilum and then the heavier pilum, right? So the objective was in a matter of few seconds to throw these two javelins in sequence to disrupt the cohesion of the enemy formation, the enemy charging formation. So this happened with literally these two formations charged, at least for what we can realize. And a formation of troops all throwing together this heavy javelins means that the first row of the enemy ranks get obliterated. Like, there is like one pilum for each 30 square centimeters. So basically on your shield you're gonna collect like tons of pila. So you're done for. So this means that the first rank gets overwhelmed. Other people fall over. The people who have fallen in the first rank, the whole thing get disrupted, right? And when enemies enter in contact with the Romans, basically all they have to wait is the time before they get defeated, right? Because order is literally every single damn thing there, right? If you keep order in the formation, you've won, right? And you say, well, didn't the enemies do the similar things? Well, in part they did. The only problem is that they didn't have the same degree of coordination as the Roman had, because they didn't have the same degree of training, right? And collective training there makes you understand why it's so important, because if you have an individual training, you can't throw a javelin and being a perfect marksman in this regard and to be good at that. But the point of the story is throwing the pila all together, right? So that that makes throwing like 100 pila in 1 second and doing it like in 100 seconds for every second for 100 seconds makes a huge deal of difference. It's the same number of javelins and the same number of damage, but not the same degree of confusion that you can make on an enemy rank. If you threw them all together, it's a freaking mess, and that's where you have to exploit, right? Because the enemy gets disordered in that moment, you can easily overthrow him, and that's how the Romans made it, right? And we know they made it pretty damn well, right? That's why the pilum is so important, and that's why it was in two types, right? Because the first one, the lighter one, had to be thrown like at a longer distance, while the enemy was kind of still far during the charge, and then the last one, the heavier one, at a closer range, so that you could exploit the power of it in its weight, and the force that you could give it at a close range, right? So with loading it with all energy, it wouldn't go dispersed in a few, over the distance. That was the practical employment, and it's important to state this, because this makes you understand that it has nothing to do with the technology, right? The technology of the pilum that gets shaped and that function, that it breaks, that it is one thing, but the thing that really makes the difference is the employment. That is the doctrine, not the technology. Because definitely other peoples had the same technology to make those kind of javelins, but they wouldn't know how to use it if they didn't, in the same effective way the Romans did, because they didn't have enough collective training that their societies could put together in terms of resources, because training costs a freaking lot. In order to train large bodies of men, you have to spend enormous amount of energies, of calories. That costs. A tribe doesn't have that. An empire has, right? So that's what really makes the big difference. And Roman training, and I can't stress this enough, is brutal, is bloody, right? Roman discipline is something, that destroys you, literally. So that the idea was that the training had to be so intense that it would have to be just like a real fight was, that the Romans also had. At this time they were kind of milding down. They had things like the decimation, right, for which the cowards would be, the coward unit would be decimated in case of effective rout or stuff like that. Rare at this time in the late Roman Republic, but it did happen. It happened in Pompeian's armies. It happened in during even with Mark Antony later. It existed, but it was at discretion of the generals. Also because, as we have seen, actually before the Augustan formalization, say, of the permanent units, it wasn't quite of a true military, fixed military organic, right? Even the Marian reform had somewhat, it was not a professionalization. For example, in the career and certain things, even centurions took some time before they actually became this fixed figures in the army, etc. So even the punishments were sometimes issued just on the base, not of a book, but on the discretion of the general, because as we've seen, there was also a largely private way of dealing with these things, but in having armies in the first place. So being too harsh sometimes is not really the answer for a better military performance. So this is an important point. It's like, for example, in comparison, the testudo, the famous tortoise formation, which is not properly even it's kind of a formation, but it's really also here many people think it's like a combat formation. It was absolutely not a combat formation. The testudo is like the best in the worst conditions. Like, if you're in open field and you're targeted by enemies, or you have to approach enemy walls, I mean, every idiot is able to understand that if you put a shield over your head and you stick all together, you can shield the unit. But this was not fit for direct combat, right? A testudo in combat, in melee, is vulnerable. It doesn't, it blocks movements. The enemy can take you down relatively easily. It's mostly for defending against projectiles. And surprise, surprise, what is often not known is that also every other single people used such formations. Like there are same Roman sources writing that the Celts, the Gauls, used the testudo, like all the others. Like if they are targeted by enemy fire, that they all put their shields over them and they used it. Do you think that's a proof of civilization? Everybody can understand that. There's nothing to factually even explaining here. It's a sensible thing to do. Point. End of the story. Then it's obvious that the Romans could do sometimes this better because they were quicker, but it's not because it's a scenographic thing that you see in movies that it has to become a defining quality of the Roman army, right? It's actually a pretty sad thing you have to do, if you find yourself into the condition of having to do it, right? Because it's mostly a passive formation for shielding yourself from projectiles. That's all what it is, literally, right? So where the heroism or the cool side of the story here, like with any other people could do it, But I guess that just for saying this thing, someone will go nuts because I've destroyed this world fantasy. But aside from this, these are important elements that start defining the Roman army as as more than what had already been before. It's really bringing the development of the Roman military system to a next step, and implementing it and fluidifying and maximizing its effects. What is very interesting about Roman warfare this time is indeed that it's a military system that can replicate itself basically without much of a problem. That's what a professional systems allows you to do. Having the human material for fighting without even having to train them every time you recruit them, right? It's the idea every soldier already knows what to do. Take Caesar's armies. Like Caesar was, as we know, one of the greatest generals of the ancient world and Roman history, but never close to the real top. Caesar is a politician lent to war, and this doesn't diminish the greatness of his figure. But, for example, in his case, he led his legions victoriously throughout all the known world at that point, and he never reformed the army. Like, probably there were some changes, adaptations that were carried out during these military campaigns, but that was a military instrument that Caesar had in his hands that already knew how to work by itself. The Roman engineering capabilities, the discipline, training. It's not that Caesar had to change that. He was a very charismatic man that was loved and followed, spontaneously by soldiers because of his greatness. But he, that was the military machine the Roman Republic had created since centuries of exercise, and that was now at the fullest of its functioning. It would remain actually for centuries as long as it was an empire. At the end of the day, that's what empires do. They have professional militaries, right? And the engineering capabilities, maybe we didn't talk about them much, but the Romans were probably the best way to define a Roman legionary at this point, especially from the late Republic onwards, is an assault engineer. Like, what really defined here the Roman legionary was its ability to basically build camps, fortifications, entrenchments in every single damn condition. Under fire, in the dire straits, even environmentalists. I mean, the Roman legionary knew already which thing he had to do. While marching, while setting the camp, the Romans already had in mind where the camp would form like, visually, on a field. Every soldier knew the same exact spot, the exact spot where he had to build his own tent. The Romans had this weapon that was the dolabra, right? That is a sort of pickaxe, fundamentally, that sometimes could be used even as a weapon, especially against armor. It was pretty damn effective. That was the instrument, however, through which he built these entrenchments and fortifications and used it. And this was really the greatness of the Romans. You're building bridges, and think about the one of Caesar over the Rhine, and siege equipment and all this, something that other people subjectively didn't have, nor like Hellenistic warfare had produced similar things, especially in terms of technology, of torch and catapults that Romans also adopted, but the degree of engineering skills widespread in the army is something that nobody ever topped after the Romans in this ancient world. And this meant that the army could be, let's say, assisted by this continuous, let's say, in fact, engineering capabilities, logistical functions that made it, that gave it a strategical range that a few other armies had. The Romans were famous for their marches. Actually, this maybe has been a bit overly emphasized, meaning that the Romans were the first ones that obviously cared about portraying themselves as more than individual fighters, because that sounded a bit too barbarian. Were able, in fact, to destroy the enemy without even needing to fight. Right? Sometimes the Romans built their own siege machines before the city walls, and cities would immediately surrender because they didn't have means to counter those. So this is naturally a very intelligent thing. It's like, that I don't remember that say that during World War II, I don't remember which general said that a pint of sweat can save like a pint of blood or something like that. And that's effectively what the Romans did. What gave them really an edge, both tactically and strategically, over so many other peoples. Even giving that, the symmetry was pretty low in the ancient world in general. So yeah, surely the Germans weren't able to build a Roman camp. This doesn't mean that they weren't able to defeat the Romans, right? And not just in an ambush. Actually, they made it also in open field sometimes. But the idea is that there is something that goes beyond the individual equipment, beyond the individual training, has to do on how you really put everything together, right? This is really a big deal in a world where objectively empires are rare, right? Because there had been empires since forever at that point in millennia, but most of the rest of this, in most developed areas of the world, in the rest it was mostly like tribes, right? So the tribe has this evident problem that it's just a tribe, and even by joining with other tribes, it's still pretty, there is no central direction. It's very difficult to make everything work the right way, because there is no centralization. There is it's a problem even to bring a sufficient amount of troops on the field, right? The Romans, I think, there is a few to say regarding to this. I think that they are the most interesting concepts in here. Then we could talk about something else in terms of I don't know, here battle card. What can we talk about here? But about fencing, how we don't really know. We don't have fencing treatises about Roman times. Naturally, as we were saying before, we can observe the panoply and saying, what kind of warfare this was entailed. Well, okay, we could say it, but I don't know. The thing is normally that Roman training contemplated this very sharp and rapid movements aimed at either the neck or the armpit. Was were the areas that were uncovered, or kneeling and cutting the enemy leg tendons from the behind. Was also often done to take the enemy out. And naturally, a legionary, as we were saying before, was a killing machine. There are not other ways a soldier has to be in this sense. You have, knowing what you have in the front, how you can kill him in like 3 seconds, right? So it's very interesting to study all the various combinations. There are, the various combat techniques. Maybe we can do it one day. We surely do it one day. Maybe today we don't have time. But we have to always bear in mind that such things remain largely conjectural, right? And we have to surrender to the reality that even if we can apply some form of military logic to certain things, we will never actually, if you don't have a direct evidence, it's always an hypothesis, it's always a theory, and can be better or worse than another, but it's still it's still a theory, right? Same goes for how these legionnaires actually fought on the field. How did a cohort fight? Do you think we know how a cohort fought? We don't. We don't know whether it was a single line, there were intervals, nobody knows. And always remember, if you find someone who claims to know this person is lying. Because there is no evidence. We have a very few, like two single, one is Polybius if I'm not wrong, and the other is Vegetius, mentions throughout all Roman history of what the distance, for example, between a legionary and another was, right? And if you make the comparison, either this was an open order or a kind of a phalanx, we don't know, and this naturally varies because every single army in history is different from another. All right, and there are not tactical formulas that you say, this was the Roman legion. You always fought this way. Every single Roman legion was a different army, with a different experience, with different challenges, with different enemies. How do you think things work in real history? This is a video game, we can recruit one unit and that is identical to another. That's not like that. I can think of much more right now, given that this was really a conceptual history, right? And that it has to do with thinking the Roman army in perspective and with some depth. Yeah, and since this is also about the Roman legionnaire, actually we don't go as far as talking about tactics, that we'll definitely try to do at one point. Talking about, in fact, how we think the legions might have fought in some way, because obviously there is some reference, just that it's sometimes pretty vague or imprecise. But it's still largely conjectural what you can see. What is important at this point is thinking that aside from the turmi of each legion, there's just like 120 knights. The whole Roman legion. This is important. The Roman legion is heavy infantry, but and this is particularly important. Was there a differentiation of the troops within the same legionary infantry? Was it all literally uniform, or there were changes within? Well, the question is a bit badly posed, because I think we spent today a big deal of time in explaining what the why there was the homogenization, the reduction ad unum, let's say, of the Roman legionnaire type, modeled on the one of the princeps of the Manipular Legion. However, you have always to think that being equipped uniformly in one way doesn't mean that you can't pick up another weapon or take your armor off or lightening up your gear and fighting as another type of soldier, right? For example, we have seen that the velites, for example, disappear from the organic of the cohortal legion. What happened? Well, we also explained that there were auxiliaries that could do that, like very cheap units you could recruit literally everywhere you went, because it's full of skirmishers out there in the world, like hunters and But we actually have a lot of evidence of Roman legionnaires fighting as skirmishers. Skirmishers? Yes, as lighter troops that would abandon their gear, their armor, etc., and would assault like lighter troops, maybe even without armor. And say, well, why would you abandon armor? Because it's freaking heavy, right? And there are definitely moments in which, in combat, being lighter or faster can save your life better than wearing an armor, right? That's why the skirmisher is light, because it can run, and it has to do something that at the end of the day is useful. So it's not foolish. Even that's why, for example, some barbarians at this point fought naked. Aside from the fact that being naked can be some sort of intimidating, right? These guys thought to look like beasts, these animals that they thought that possessed them, as spirits, etc. But first, try to fight with iron on in summer, right? It's not a very pleasing experience. We're pretty, there's a huge amount of evidence throughout all military history of armored guys who had to take off their armor in summer because they were literally dying of heat, right? Therefore, usually some padded cloth isolating of some isolating material was used underneath the armor, sometimes even over. But also you get lighter, a lot lighter, which means you can get out of the way, take yourself out of trouble much more quickly, right? Obviously, it's a very theoretical idea. It's not that, it depends where you're fighting, how, what's the point. Tendentially, if you find that Roman legionaries at this time start being all equipped with mail armor, it's because evidently that was a pretty convenient thing to do. And obviously the average Roman legionary would fight largely with that on. But there were definitely situations in which this could be changed. If they had to fight in a difficult terrain, had to be lighter, or if they had to march for very long. Sometimes Caesar was a master in this stuff, of lightening up the legionary equipment in order to make troops marching like for even up to 80 kilometers in a few, like in a day and a half or something like that. And naturally it does make a difference. Here in that passage specifically wasn't specified whether they brought their armor or not. Presumably they did, but they usually marched more lightly than the usual. So this is important. The Roman legionary at this point could really fight in many different ways, given the tactical odds, right, and necessities. Another thing we didn't talk about was, by the way, they could fight not only as skirmishers, they could fight also as slingers or archers. Actually, we have evidence even during, Roman civil wars, etc., of Roman legionaries actually using slings or bows, right? Why not? Do you think a Roman legionary wouldn't be trained with such weapons? Think that, if you joined the Roman army, the only thing you could use was a Gladius and a pilum? Evidently not. Why? Consider that these guys, as we've seen at this point, were spending a lot of time in the army. And training, also in terms of internal competition, camaraderie, etc., is, it's a thing. These guys played games. They went on horseback. They used, even bow on horseback. Do you think a Roman legionary was not able to use a bow, maybe even on horseback? Well, you're wrong. Why wouldn't he been, right? The fact that he preferably fought in one way doesn't mean that he didn't know how to use other weapons. Remember, these were professionals, so they had a lifetime of training, right? Then, about training proper, in fact, what did naturally using all these weapons, as we've seen, simulating fights in this sense, a lot of marches, as always, performing maneuvers over and over again. Always remember that the first thing is order, right? The first thing is maintaining order in situations where you have to move, you have to change formation fast, you have to deploy. The Romans had already, started to do this very, very early, right? Before, we hinted at this progressive, emancipation of the Romans from seasonalism into something more professional since a very early age, in the 3rd, even the 4th century BC. Often, that is overlooked as well, but these are changes that began relatively early in time. The other point here is physical training. Legionnaires were taught how to swim. They were making, I don't remember how it's the term in English, but kind of tree logs, rolling, stuff like that. They had to obviously to build camps that destroys you physically. It was a pretty harsh discipline, of course. There was some also extra, all you can imagine, but very intensely practiced, because that really made the difference. The Roman army was famous also for its strict discipline, of course, which meant that punishments were pretty harsh. But as we've seen, there was a relative discretion in applying the punishments, and so on. There was club training. Using clubs was something for very, very ancient. It's one of the first weapons ever used for training in history. And the Romans did even meet enemies equipped with clubs, like the Germans did. The Romans met exactly in this late Republican times. They were basically not even into the Iron Age proper. They used clubs. Yes, there was some sort of primitive people still. This partly triggered also the maybe we could make a point in this sense in terms of even how the Romans adopted, for example, Celtic weaponry, seemingly their equipment weighted. Yes, it is true. Many people like to draw direct parallelisms between the employment of certain weapons and the evolution of the Roman armor. But this is a bit simplistic and mechanicistic. It's true. Like, if you go to fight against the Celts, you find pretty massive, heavy blows with these swords that would make you wear Celtic helmets with neck guard, or reinforce your shoulders with double layers of mail. And eventually, even the segmented armor is often said, it was against the Parthian arrows or against the Thracian/Dacian Rhomphaia, for example. But the point is also that an armor remains an armor everywhere. We fight segmented armor in Britain, so it has nothing to do with the East, but the concept is that, more armor means more protection from every kind of bullet or any kind of weapon, right? So, it's a simple choice. Can you afford that? Is it convenient? Is there a cost-benefits ratio that is favorable to you? If yes, you use it. If not, you don't. It's that simple. So it's definitely possible that these were, having met different populations that used this kind of heavier weapons, that it's also a bit simplistic to put it, like triggered the appearance of such armor within the Romans, but couldn't it have the Roman army? But couldn't it have been just like the Romans had, like the largest amount of wealth that any other empire had ever had by Augustan times, for example, and that therefore the military could afford such expenses, like we're having better protected soldiers? It is true, as it's also true that they could have invested this stuff maybe in kind of better technology, which they did, right? So in comparison to this, even the idea that these weapons probably made a difference by creating extra parts of armor as a response, yep, it's possible, but it's not the only thing. And yeah, so it's never think that technology needs someone, like it's a matter that needs to be explained in order to be applied. In order to be applied, it needs to find fertile ground. And then human mind is extremely flexible. You can learn it very simply. The point is having the conditions that allow you to employ it, which is a totally different thing than just not knowing that there was that kind of weapon or type of stuff. The Romans fought against the Gauls for centuries. It's not that they, the fact that they waited for Caesar's times to adopt kind of Gallic equipment and to kind of spread it throughout the army it's maybe not really the reason, right? That might have catalyzed it, channeled it, accelerated it, but and consider also that aside from the iconic representations of the Roman legionaries, really at this time the Romans had a great variety and diversity of equipment. Sometimes, especially in the first half of the 2nd century BC, there is still a lot of, but even beyond, there's still a lot of Hellenic style equipment, right? Literally pieces of Hellenic armor, or at least Hellenic styled armor, that is, like here also it's very important to be able to distinguish different types of troops aside from what they wear, right? When you find a soldier that is equipped with the weapon that is styled after the fashion of other people, doesn't mean that soldier fights like that people. That's particularly important to understand. That's one of the myths when you say, for example, there were Latin or Etruscan soldiers, were the warriors, let's say better, that were equipped with a Greek hoplon, an Hellenic hoplon, but it doesn't mean that they were hoplites, right? Sometimes it's not entirely what makes sense, but also what was fashionable, for example, that is applied seriously. Also, we should be able to distinguish what is, kind of a artistic representation from actual archaeological finds. Archaeological finds are much more brutal and functional than what naturally you can see on. Do you think that the Roman legionaries of the 1st century AD were what you can see on the Trajan on the 2nd century, 1st century, 2nd century, are what you can't see like on things like a Trajan's column? Archaeology tells us a completely different story, right? But everybody knows Trajan's column and thinks that that's reality, which is funny because it's exactly what the Roman emperors wanted the Roman people to know at the time about their army, and that we still believe today, largely. So that's really how certain things happen, and I think it's very, very fascinating to look at the stuff, just to get your mind blown a little bit and to accept that there are things that we have problems to think straight. And yeah, okay. So I think for today we have said enough. It was a bit of a ramble. I did this completely without any form of script, and I don't know how it turns, but I've concentrated a bit of pills of information can be useful. And as I was saying at the beginning of the video, we will talk about this stuff over and over again in detail, right? Today we talk about a lot of stuff, not in detail. On Schwerpunkt we will cover literally everything if I have enough time, and yeah, that's it. So I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.